So the reliance on Russia for gas and oil has come under the spotlight as the conflict with Ukraine continues. And questions are being asked about whether major energy producers on the continent like Nigeria, Angola, Libya and Algeria can pitch in and replace Russia's supply. To help us make sense of whether that is a possibility, we're joined by Mabhena-Olagunju, oil and gas lawyer and CEO of DLO Energy Resource Group. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, Linda. I think perhaps let's start with an understanding of what we need to know about the ecosystem of oil on the continent.
Thank you very much for having me. Well, we have large oil discoveries, obviously, on the continent. We have two large producers, namely Nigeria and Angola in sub-Saharan Africa. And the war has obviously brought about what we would say is an opportunity for Africa to position itself as a mass gas exporter to Europe. However, there are challenges that remain, and mainly those circulate around the dependability of supply that comes out of Africa, because most of the supply comes from volatile areas where there is war. We have seen that in the Niger Delta in Nigeria, as well as recently in Mozambique, where Total had to pull out its staff due to the ongoing terrorism in the country. So the second part of the problem lies around the infrastructure and making sure that these countries are actually able to export this gas to the extent that there's gas surplus available. And mostly in North Africa, they have been accessing the European market. However, they're trying to increase capacity given the current challenges that are being faced by Europe. Sub-Saharan Africa remains a challenge from a pipeline perspective, but we've been seeing shipment of gas in the form of LNG as a means of exporting and transporting the hydrocarbon to access markets.
A myriad of challenges. I wondered, though, how big an issue financing is in all of this.
As we saw post-COP26, a number of funders were moving away from funding what we call dirty energy or hydrocarbon resources. So oil and gas, there was a move towards not investing anymore in new discoveries. And now, following what is happening in the energy crisis in Europe, there's been an application to treat gas as a green energy source, which is quite interesting, given that post-COP26, we thought it was done for oil and gas, but now we're in a position where the world is going to need more oil and gas than it has previously needed in the immediate term. So we're seeing an increase in drilling operations in countries like Nigeria. We're seeing that Total is bringing back its staff to Mozambique, and to the extent of addressing security concerns in Mozambique, some companies are now making sure that their plants are located offshore where it's not easy to access and to attack those production facilities. But be that as it may, we are seeing that in order to meet Europe's supply, we are going to have to do quite a lot as Africa to tap into that, to access. What I am hoping that this brings about is an investment by African leadership in infrastructure in general, because that is going to give Africa the opportunity to access a market. And I think it's important to dispel the notion that renewables operates is just opposed to gas. For me, gas and solar make the perfect marriage in terms of making sure that there's a stability of supply and there's that base load for the countries that have access to gas, such as Mozambique, Angola, and Nigeria, etc.
When you say countries need to do quite a lot, what is that quite a lot?
So from an infrastructure, we find that there's not enough pipelines that are put in from an infrastructure perspective. Now, let's take it more even just to the oil perspective of things as to the average consumers. You find countries like Nigeria being a high producer of oil and gas, but having very few refineries. Dangote is building one. That project has run over as well from a time perspective, but we are finding that we are producing the oil in Africa, but exporting it to be refined and sold back to us in a finished product. So that has an impact on the price that consumers pay at the petrol station. Now, when you talk about gas, from an infrastructure perspective, we've been seeing that there's been a lot of gas flaring on the African continent. That's due largely to the fact that people find it difficult to monetize the gas previously. One, the cost of gas in countries like Nigeria was not cost reflective. Two, there wasn't the infrastructure such as the pipelines to make sure that the gas was accessible. There were pipelines were being sabotaged by militant groups, for example, in the Niger Delta. So security around the infrastructure. But typically we find that there's an underinvestment by African states in gas infrastructure. That is starting to change now with the Africa Free Trade Agreement. We're starting to see collaboration amongst African countries. We're starting to see more investment towards, gas pipelines to give us access. South Africa as well is going to be relying heavily on the gas produced in Mozambique as part of its gas to power program.
Quite an interesting conversation I had with a friend over your article yesterday, who mentioned that this might not be a good idea in terms of, oil and gas producing countries on the continent to cover the gap left by Russia because of what he calls the resource curse, which will come back, even with more severe consequences for the continent. Do you have a thought on this?
I think the continent is a bit wiser. I mean, Namibia has just made a huge discovery of oil and gas. I think the issue is not about the hydrocarbon discovery, it's about leadership and the systems you have in place. Corruption, as we know, exists in every sphere of our society, and we cannot stop ourselves from exploring the opportunities that exist because of the fear of not being able to run the resources well. I think it boils down to leadership. We've learned our lessons from countries like Nigeria. I think we know what not to do. And I think we've also learned positive lessons from countries like Nigeria on what to do insofar as local content and skills development. What's critical for these new countries that are discovering oil and gas is to make sure that the people in those countries stand to benefit from the resources. It's to make sure you have a skilled population that can actually access these projects and make a meaningful change to the economy of that country. And I think the resources curse really can be avoided if our leadership on this continent is clear and direct about the use of those resources.
Leadership, leadership, leadership. It all boils down to that. Even if we were to make the African Continental Free Trade Area Act work, it's definitely dependent on leadership. Thank you very much for your insights this afternoon. Linda Mabhena-Olagunju is an oil and gas lawyer as well as CEO of DLO Energy Resource.